Thank you so much for expressing interest in joining Riparian Rangers. We're going to just kind of introduce Riparian Rangers, what it is, who the Alliance is, and what we do. So let's start there. We have been around about 50 years now at this point. We started in 1971. It was initially a just coalition of scientists, concerned citizens. This is kind of around the environmental revolution of the 60s and 70s. People were, kind of waking up a little bit to water quality and environmental quality issues. And the Alliance was started right around that time and right around that kind of central issue of water quality in the Chesapeake Bay itself. Obviously, the Chesapeake Bay, what happens in the bay, how the bay is doing, is not just a factor of what is going on in the bay itself. It's this entire massive watershed. The Chesapeake Bay is really awesome. It is the third largest estuary in the entire world, for instance. It's the biggest estuary in the entire United States. It's a gem. It's a total gem. But one of the other really special things about it is, relative to most your kind of average estuary, it has a really big watershed footprint for the size of the estuary itself. So that's why we have such a hard time cleaning it up, right? Is because everything that happens up here, I'm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania right now, hundreds of miles from the bay itself, but what happens here is going to affect the bay. And so we have focused for a lot of those, 50 years plus, depending on when you're watching this, on restoring the watershed itself. And when we work in the watershed, we're restoring the bay, but we're also restoring that local water. And we're able to work with that local community. So that's the Alliance. How about Riparian Rangers? This is a little volunteer corps that was started in 2019. We train volunteers on on the basics of growing a young forest and taking care of a young forest. And then we assign, match more really, kind of what's closest to you, what's closest to your work, what's closest to your school, whatever makes most sense for you for a site. And then we train you there at that site. And then our Riparian Rangers, really what they are committing to is visiting that site about once a month during the growing season. And so that would be roughly March through October, kind of about 6 visits a year to come in, tend to the site, help us keep these trees alive, and help us grow a young forest. Starting in 2021 here, we are debuting this branch structure where we have like the main stem, if you will, of Riparian Rangers, which is kind of Alliance sites that we're serving to do that connecting with the volunteers and coordination. But if we have a group of riparian forest buffers in kind of a geographic area that is not here, and most of those sites are not Alliance sites, it makes a lot more sense to have someone else facilitating that kind of communication, coordination with the Riparian Rangers. And so that's kind of what the branch structure is we have branch leaders, which is also a pun. The leader is the terminal bud at the very end of a branch. But so what they are serving to do so far, they have been all Conservation District employees, and we'll kind of see as things grow. But they are serving to find the riparian forest buffers that need maintenance and find the volunteers, connect them to each other. The Alliance is still a part of the picture. We're serving to train those Riparian Ranger volunteers, equip them with everything they need, and also facilitate the information exchange, getting all the site reports, from the site to that local branch leader. So that's a very, very exciting new component, and maybe as you're signing up here for Riparian Rangers, you're part of a branch rather than kind of the main trunk. So welcome, either way. If you're interested in other ways to volunteer for the Alliance, we have tons of other ways to volunteer. This is probably the most intensive way. This is the way that's going to get you most bit up by bugs and, in tall vegetation and stuff, but we have tons of tree plantings, volunteer tree plantings, every planting season. So in autumn and in spring, kind of around the watershed, but a lot of our volunteer plantings are kind of in southeastern Pennsylvania. We also have Project Clean Stream, which is a trash cleanup program. So that is kind of more, it could be lighter intensity, it could be something maybe a little bit more family friendly, that kind of thing too. And we also have water quality monitoring volunteer opportunities. And so I highly recommend you check out, if you go to our website, allianceforthebay.org, there's a little tab up at the top. If you click Get Involved and then Volunteer. Again, welcome to the Alliance, welcome to Riparian Rangers. Let's get to work. Thank you so much for your help. As a Riparian Ranger, you will get trainings. You'll get a hands-on training at your site. you'll be kind of showed your site and kind of the whole layout and where everything is, and get additional training there. We're also doing a lot of group training, so you will get in-field training for sure. But we still wanted to make this video to kind of complement that. Basically, like just to have at your fingertips if you kind of forget everything, want to brush up at the start of a new field season, something like that. So let's run through it all. So kind of first question, most important question, is when do you visit your sites? We kind of would prefer if about once a month during the growing season the sites were visited, but we understand if things come up, things happen, things change. So the growing season is kind of March or April, depending on exactly where you are, through about October, and so about 6 times a year is ideal. Additionally, we frequently get pretty gnarly storms, pretty severe storms, and so if there's a really bad storm, a lot of flooding in your area, it might be a good idea to kind of make a special trip out to just check up on everything and make sure that the tubes are all standing straight. So if you do have something come up and you think you'll miss a visit or 2 visits or 3 visits, just reach out to to us or to your branch leader and let them know, and maybe they could put in a sub that month, or maybe it's just fine, especially if it's not the first growing season for your site. If it's year 3 or something, it might be totally okay to skip a couple months. So just reach out and communicate, and we'll figure it out. So in addition to when are you going to your site, what are you going to bring to your site? Very, very important. People like to do different things. I like to bring a bucket. I'm a big bucket guy. I like to bring a bucket on site because you will inevitably find trash. You'll inevitably find cool plants you want to bring home, leaves, samples, whatever. You'll find stuff that you'll want to bring home. And I like this a little bit better than a backpack, but some people like a backpack better. That's certainly easier to walk around the site. What do you need? Really highly recommend wearing gloves. There's a lot of kind of, sharp things, stinging insects, a lot of stuff. Good to have hand protection. Ideal to have a mallet, a hammer of some sort to pound in stakes. We have your handy handbook that will be very valuable for you as well. Ideal to bring some loppers or pruners for cutting off branches and all sorts of other stuff that we'll talk about in a little bit. Extra bird nets, which we will supply to you. Extra zip ties or wire ties, which we will also supply to you. Something to mark dead trees with, so either spray paint or flags or a Sharpie or whatever, but again, we can supply that as well. Pocket knife, one of your most valuable tools. And then additionally, I think that's all the tools I can think of right now anyway, but make sure you're protecting yourself, while you're out there. Some sites like the one I'm on is a park, and it's, I could be wearing flip-flops here and it would probably be okay, but I still wouldn't want to be wearing flip-flops. We highly recommend you wear boots. Even though it's going to be really hot in the middle of the summer when you're doing your visits, I recommend wearing boots and tall pants. Now let's talk about what are you going to do at the site. So we can kind of split this into sort of 2 big sort of groups of tasks. You're actually working on the tending of the site, helping save all these trees that if you didn't put in that effort, they probably wouldn't make it, or they would be severely deformed. We'll run through all that stuff in a bit. Also, what we want you to do is be our eyes and ears on the site. That is a huge, huge way that Riparian Rangers are helping us out. Knowing if the maintenance is getting done, knowing if livestock have gotten in, that kind of thing. So, in your handbook, you can turn to your section on that. We're really looking at, what the information that you're passing along to us tells us if we need to respond, if we need to do anything other than just kind of wait, let the trees, continue to grow. So is the site being maintained? Since the last time you were there, was it mowed? Was it sprayed? We actually, as we were walking to this site, we saw the guy on the mower drive right by, and you could see, this was mowed very, very recently. But obviously also, even if there wasn't just, recently cut grass on the ground, you could tell very readily that this is being maintained fully. You can also see around each tree a spot of bare soil to indicate that it's being sprayed with herbicide as well. So we have the maintenance here. So just because we don't have very, very short vegetation doesn't mean, we're in a bad situation. I would say this is looking good still. This site does still need to be mowed. It does still need those rings of herbicide, but we are not hampering the survival, the success, the growth of this tree. All we're doing is we have a little bit more risk right now because we're in the middle of the summer for vole depredation, for voles to eat up our trees. Really the most important time for things to be nice and cleared is going into winter. But for right now, even though this hasn't been mowed, I would say it's looking okay. So on our agricultural sites, oftentimes instead of mowing the entire site in between the trees for that maintenance mowing, we're just mowing in strips along the rows of trees. And you can see that's what's been done here. So yeah, you know, we have more vole cover on the site than, you know, maybe would be ideal, but by doing this, by only doing the minimum amount of mowing, we're retaining a lot of good vegetation still, we're retaining a lot of good habitat, a lot of good cover, and so it's kind of a little bit of a balance. Also, from a logistics standpoint of all the grants and everything that we're managing, it's cheaper to have the contractors just go up the row and down the row rather than mowing the entire site. So you can expect that if you have an agricultural site, it may look more like this, where you don't have a lot of space to move. Really, you know, what's been mowed is just kind of the rows themselves. If you are on a farm site where, you know, again, I'm joking a little bit here, if you have a cow into your riparian forest buffer, I don't care if it's a Saturday or a Sunday or whatever, let somebody know ASAP. Email, you know, riparianrangers@allianceforthebay.org. We need to know that cow's in there. We need to get that cow out. We need to send somebody, a riparian ranger or one of us, in to fix up all the trees. If we fix up all the trees that they knock over, they'll all live. It's all totally fine. But if a month goes by and we then see the report, a lot of those trees might have died just being trapped, you know, in the shelter. So really important to let us know ASAP on that. Signs of animal browsing, that's another important feature, because yeah, sometimes, you know, we have these 5-foot tall shelters, but sometimes we have shorter shelters. Sometimes other partners who aren't us will plant things in shorter shelters. We've kind of moved away from that right now anyway, but you know, so reporting signs of animal damage is also very valuable for us to know. And then any other, you know, additional information is super valuable. So I don't think many of our volunteers usually put in any additional information, but we love it when they do. It could even be, hey, it was a nice day. Hey, I saw, you know, a purple coneflower blooming, something like that. But it's nice to have additional details in there, especially of like, oh boy, this corner of the site looks a little rougher than the others, stuff like that. Any helpful information you think we might need. And then another really important thing, especially as we're planning ahead, is how many trees have survived. Because we like to replant in the first couple years of this site's growth. We like to replant 100%. Everything that dies, we want to replant every autumn, or as close to every autumn as we can, so that we pretty much stay at 100% survival when the trees are young. Then we can let things kind of, you know, shift over time, but we want to give them all a really good chance and then let them, you know, do their thing. So keeping a rough tally is really valuable. This is harder to do than you might think, you know, as you're moving through a site. If it takes you 3 hours or 4 hours to do a site, it's going to be hard to kind of remember. So people kind of do different sort of tricks on doing this. Sometimes I'll take a tally on things. So you can see inside of my bucket here, I took tallies on one site I was at of how many trees were dead, so that I can make a note of that later. This monitoring report corresponds to a Google form online, basically an online version of this that we think should take you less than a minute to fill out. I think less than a minute. So as soon as you get home, if you just want to do that real quick before you even jump in the shower or whatever, or maybe you're like right after you get out of the shower for, you know, tick safety, that would be great. But again, this is just such a valuable part, is just having this information on the kind of practitioner end. So thank you for providing it for us. Thank you for doing the monitoring work. Okay, now let's pivot to the tending itself, to that maintenance work. So the monitoring tasks, very, very, very important. The tending tasks are also super important. Basically what you're doing, because we have people, either we're paying the landowners or we're paying a contractor or the municipality or whatever to do the mowing, do the spraying, you know, that's gonna get done. And that is a kind of bare minimum for getting our trees to survive. But the shelters that keep them alive from deer can kill them in other ways. They can get tangled up in here, they can get deformed in here, they can die in here. So what we need our riparian rangers to do is help us just take care of the individual trees, keep them safe from themselves, from the shelters, from animals, until they can start to take care of themselves. So one of the most important tasks that you will be doing, and the kind of quickest task, is just removing the bird net from the top of the shelter. So usually most of this work will happen in year 1 and year 2. We put these bird nets on the top of the shelters because a lot of birds will try to explore into there and then they'll get stuck, and then they'll die. And we don't want that to happen. We're trying to save birds, not kill them here. So we put these nets over top. But what we actually like is for these nets to have a hole in the middle so that the tree can grow out of them. That doesn't always happen, especially if we have, you know, volunteer plantings or something. or just over time, it kind of falls down. So when your tree is close to the top of the shelter, you can actually go ahead and remove the net. This one you can see it's starting to get a little kind of twisted in there. So this is a little tulip poplar that probably didn't appreciate being kind of scrunched down like that. And so we don't really have to worry, this guy isn't going to be impacted, but you will see trees corkscrew up in there. When that happens, we'll look for examples out here, but I don't know if we'll find any today. When that happens, when they're corkscrewing around, just find the part where before things kind of started to bend and cut off there with your loppers. Unfortunately, we'll just have to send up a new leader, and it'll probably be fine in the long run, but we're not going to do any favors by leaving this tree, you know, with a corkscrew at the top of it. So let's go over now through the rest of the tasks. So saving the tree from this bird net, very important. You're also going to need to save the tree from this shelter. So they don't always stay up like they always should. Sometimes this wood will rot off. Sometimes a mower or an errant cow will break in or something, and it'll, you know, get pushed over. A heavy storm, whatever happens, we need to make sure these get lifted up as soon as we can. So I see one right over here. Let's go check it out, see what's going on. Okay. Ooh boy. So we can see, I would say this is a mower strike, would be how this happened here. We have, yeah, there we go. So just a weed. This is why you wear gloves, so you don't have to even worry about what vegetation that is. So, yeah, this is another tulip poplar. Doesn't look great. I would guess that it's probably been sitting, you know, on its side for quite a while. Additionally, here we can see it probably got pulled out by getting hit by the mower, but all of this should be in the soil, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and try to replant it real quick and see. That might save this tree's life too. You want to place the stake so that when the shelter is on the stake, the tree is roughly in the middle of it. So it looks like, you know, I've put this stake a little close to the tree, but this shelter is very narrow. The shelters come nested in each other, and this looks like the smallest tube kind of on the inside. So that's why the stake is so close. Also, you want a face of the stake to be pointing at the tree. If a corner is pointing at the tree, the shelter is not really going to sit flush, and when the wind is blowing, it's going to get gradually loosened, and then it's going to start whipping around and causing damage. So we want that zip tie to be as tight as possible, and thus we want the shelter to be sitting on that square face. So we'll slide this over. Again, we'll, you know, keep our fingers crossed for this little guy, because we may as well, but we'll probably be replanting this one. Okay, so we want our shelters to be squished down into the soil a little bit. Not a ton. I've seen people put them in, you know, 5 inches or whatever. That's a little bit too much. We don't want to cause root damage, but we want to provide a little bit of rodent protection here. So if you could squish it in a little bit, you know, maybe a couple millimeters or so, half a centimeter, something like that, that's the ticket. Here's another really nice hack. So I took out my knife. I was ready to cut new holes in here, but oftentimes you don't have to do that. Sometimes the vents of the shelters, there's all these little vent holes. Sometimes you can thread the zip tie through. You can see there's not really much of a gap, you know, between there. I have seen people do it, you know, like this, where it's kind of way wide, and I really don't recommend doing that, because inside the shelter you're kind of cutting the shelter off. You're putting an obstruction in that shelter, basically. We want as little of that zip tie to be kind of out into the shelter as possible. We want it to be just hugging the side of the shelter. So we'll just thread it in through there. And again, this is why that knife comes in handy, to cut in extra holes. There we go, bingo. And then we have our bird net. I mentioned we place our bird nets kind of specifically. Over time they get kind of worn out. We get the question a lot of, should I keep them? Can we reuse them? We can't really reuse them because, yeah, the elastic just wears out. You know, you can see it barely is even sitting, but we brought an extra here, so we'll go ahead and put that on. So yeah, you have probably seen these. placed like that before. Don't do that. That's how they get tangled up. Pull it down so that there's a nice kind of silver dollar size hole in the middle. And so basically what we're looking for is this to be kind of flat up top. So that tulip poplar, if it survives, or whatever else we plant in there, should be able to grow out of that hole instead of getting tangled up. Okay, so speaking of stem issues, deformations, I see over here we have a little guy, a little hawthorn that looks like it's in trouble. You will get a lot of these situations that it's going to have to be a judgment call as to what you do. So you can see here, I think what happened is this, it looks like this crabapple is splitting its shelter. All of our shelters have a perforation down the side so that they split pretty easily, which is great, helpful oftentimes, but when they're getting big, but there's so much force in here. Maybe it was this pokeweed, you know, coming up in here or what, which I'll just go ahead and, you know, get rid of here. I like pokeweed, but, you know, we need more space in this shelter. I think what I'm going to do here, because this is clearly, this is like grown out this way, it's not just leaning out this way, I am going to cut this off, unfortunately, even though this appears to have been the main stem at one point, and we'll let this be the new leader. So that is why little hand pruners are nice to have with you. So we'll go ahead and it can be a pain, but I really like to sharpen and sanitize my pruners frequently. The sanitation is pretty important because you can actually transmit a good bit of disease between trees if you have dirty trimmers. So with these, I think, just to give it a little space, this branch is actually dead. I'm going to go ahead and trim this up because even though we're going to leave this now susceptible to deer, first of all, it's a hawthorn, it has those thorns, that'll give it a good bit of protection. And second, it's clearly trying to pop out of the shelter here, so let's just let it, let's just let the top end be free. There we go. Okay, tree rescued. That's something that you'd also likely see in an early, you know, in your first year or two, is hand weeding within the shelter. Let's look at that real quick. You know, you could spend infinite time working on this in a site. You could hand weed every single shelter. That's not going to provide so much benefit. Really, what we need you to look for is the vegetation that's also occupying the shelter hampering the growth of that tree. So this maybe would be a good example, actually, while we're here. So we have this little hawthorn that's kind of growing too strong. We have a pokeweed in here with it. So let's just go ahead and demonstrate. It's very tempting, especially when the tree is really young and you have like a lot of grass at the top growing out of the shelter, to just grab that grass and just pull it from the top. That's kind of dangerous for the tree. You can pull out a lot of soil, you can damage the tree in various ways, you can defoliate the tree. So what we actually recommend is that you go ahead and back it up, loosen your shelter, and slide it up, and then hand weed from below. So that'll also do better at getting these out. So there's my, you know, pokeberry, you know it's tough. So we're just gonna go ahead and nip it rather than do anything else. There we go. Okay, when you're doing this hand weeding, if you see anything like multiflora rose or oriental bittersweet or any other invasive plant in there, even if it's not really causing an issue yet, definitely hand weed it. It will cause an issue eventually, so we want to make sure we do that no matter what if it's invasive. So there we go. We'll tighten everything all the way as tight as possible, and then we can just pull from the top once we've severed it. Okay, there we go. So there's hand weeding within. So this won't really be an issue for the first couple years as a riparian ranger at a site. But once your site is 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, you're gonna have to start removing shelters. And that is a joyous occasion. It's a little bit of like a, you know, a graduation. This tree has made it, you know, now it's pretty much gonna take care of itself. But it's a lot of work. So the more proactive you are, the more you can start to do it, you know, earlier, the better things will be. So when can you tell, you know, when to remove a tree? Just like with a dog collar, 2 fingers underneath the collar should be able to fit. So here we can see there is 0 space. There is you can't even, you know, you couldn't even get a dog collar to fit in here. We can also see, and this is actually what attracted our attention to this tree before we even looked into the top, you can see down here the perforated edge is starting to split. So this is what these shelters are designed to do. They're designed to break off, but if we just let it break off itself, the tree is going to be rubbing against it for years. And we want to go ahead and give it a little bit of space, give it a little bit of air, reduce that abrasion. So very gently, we'll go ahead and zipper this up. I'm going to use my hands as much as I can. And then very carefully, I don't want to scour the tree, obviously. Just barely the zipper. Unfortunately, these are also not really reusable, especially after we cut them off like this. That's another very common question we get, and it is kind of heartbreaking, and it's something that bugs us immensely, that we can't really reuse much. At this point, maybe things will change. The shelters that we use will change, or people will come up with something that's truly biodegradable, but until then, we'll have to do all this labor. So we can go ahead and remove our stake. Oftentimes, after a couple years, they'll just snap right off. This was actually planted spring 2019, so this is only 2 years old, but this is a black locust, one of our fastest growing species in the east, so, which is why we love to plant black locust, because now this tree can take care of itself. So this tree here, another black locust, growing really fast, love it, it's great. We also noticed that we're starting to zipper at the bottom here. But this is a great example of a judgment call that you'll see all sorts of situations out there, because we're going to do that dog collar rule. There is a lot more space in here than two kind of fingers widths. There's plenty of space in there, but it's zippering at the bottom. It's splitting at the bottom. So that's kind of the common denominator. We need to make sure we're reducing that abrasion. That matters a little bit more than that kind of arbitrary, rule of thumb, if you will. So we'll go ahead and split it. We'll take it off. Just going to add a little bit of trunk protection, and we'll move on. Okay. Around. Here we go. Just a little bit of protection. Yeah, nothing crazy. I might do the same as I did last time and kind of add a double layer here for extra cushion, but again, this is not as restrictive as having that zip tie around there. It's going to be able to grow out, and this will fall off, sometimes, but hopefully maybe in a year or two when they're kind of slowing down with the mowing here. And also, half of the point of bark is to protect the tree from stuff like this, so the bark has to start doing its job eventually. So again, another really important task is marking how many dead trees there are so that we can order enough trees to replant every year. This is clearly dead. How can you tell if this tree is dead? Well, if it's August and there's no leaves on it, it's probably dead. Let's investigate though. Let's see what's going on, because sometimes you get stump sprouts. So it's not fully dead, it's just died back on the top and then sprouting from below. But that is not the case here. We can even look at why this died, probably. I mean, it just wasn't planted well. So that, we talked about the root, it was planted about 4 inches too high. So this is why we're, if you come to our volunteer plantings, we're on the serious side about the depth, because it's a matter of life or death for the trees. But, oh well, we'll start over, So I'll put this back on just to, the tree doesn't have to be inside it, it's just to make it easier. But if we leave the shelter here, we'll know to replant here, and we'll already have the shelter. So, a bunch of different ways to mark the dead tree. You can just use a Sharpie if you want, a big X. Sometimes I'll do kind of a band around them. Sometimes folks will bring spray paint, just a dot of spray paint. Now, if you come back the next year, you might have to use a different color spray paint, depending on how good that paint was, how well it stuck. Some people will use a flag. Some people use flagging tape, whatever you want to use to mark the dead trees. Just the idea really is for them to be visible from a distance. As you're walking around, you do not want to be checking every single tree, to know where you need to replant. Sometimes our riparian rangers can replant themselves. If you have maybe 20 trees that died, you can do that yourself. You can bring a buddy or whatever maybe and finish it in a Saturday, no sweat. Even if you have 50 trees or whatever. If you have hundreds and hundreds, we might be planting, doing the replanting for you. So make sure we can tell where the deads are and where they aren't. Okay, so that is marking your dead trees. And again, try to keep a tally, a rough tally of how many there are. I recommend marking the dead ones any time of year that you're there, even if it's well, after leaf out, I'd say. If it's still May, hold off. You know, sometimes stuff just doesn't leaf out until maybe mid-May or so. So you might visit in mid-May and say, this oak is dead, I guess, you know, but it might, you know, just be taking a little bit of time. But really, kind of moving into the summer, you can go ahead and mark them, because now that we've marked this, we don't have to check it the rest of the year. You know, we can just say, oh, yep, that one's dead. We'll just, you know, replant it in the fall. So this is where we kind of get into that invasive triage sort of thing. So in your handbook, we kind of have things split up into sort of different levels of threat. And it's because, you know, we need, ecologically, we need as few invasive plants in this area as possible. We want as many native plants, you know, in this area as possible. But there are some species of invasive plants that are going to actively pose a risk to the trees that we have planted. By outcompeting them, by girdling them, by climbing up them, all sorts of things, by impeding the success of our site. So those are things that we need to actually do something about. But we don't expect you to do all that work yourself. There are some things, like just removing something that you see on site, if there's only a couple of them around, that can be really, really helpful for us. But there are some species that really the best way to manage them would be with herbicide, and we do not expect you to do that. So those are those ones, tree of heaven namely, Japanese hops, Japanese knotweed, like some of these kind of more intensive species that are going to be posing a risk to your riparian forest buffer. Let us and or your branch leader know ASAP when you detect those on the site. But there are other species like this purple loosestrife here that is invasive, it's bad, but there's only a couple of them here on this site in this area. There's a handful, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut them down real quick. And yes, there's a monarch butterfly on it right now. There's a couple bees on it right now. Pollinators like the nectar. Half the reason this stupid plant got introduced to this continent is for this reason of people using it for an ornamental planting and for, you know, attracting pollinators, but it's not native, and it's actually giving that monarch butterfly poor nutrition, you know? It's kind of like gummy bears, you know? That's it. It's just, you know, he's getting a handful of gummy bears, whereas we want to get a lot of lipids and proteins and fats and stuff from, you know, better food sources than invasive plant tissue. But sorry guys, you'll have to go find another flower. There's a bunch of jewelweed over there. There's a bunch of ironweed over there. That'll be great. But I'm just going to go ahead and nip this off here. Now, again, this is not something that you have to do as a riparian ranger, but it is very, very helpful if you just, you know, take a second to, when you see these invasive plants that we have in your manual, to just go ahead and remove them. So by cutting this, we are not killing it. It'll be right back. But by cutting it, we are making sure it doesn't go to seed this year, and that's kind of what matters more. We're more concerned with the spread of this species than just the occurrence of it in the site, if that makes sense. So we feel that it is very important to talk about safety for a little while, because we care about you, we value your work, we value your help, we don't want you to get hurt. On our accounts, you know. Our sites sometimes can be very, you know, easy breezy, like a park site, sometimes very low risk, or a farm, there's kind of a lot of hazards around, you know. So, but even at a park, those tubes are kind of wasp magnets, you know, like you can get hurt doing this. So let's talk about safety for a little bit, and kind of how you can protect yourself and just kind of be prepared out there. So, on a farm site, let's start there, the kind of more dangerous, you know, kind of site. Stay away from machinery, stay away from animals, from livestock. A lot of people like horses and cows and stuff, but they're not pets. This isn't a petting zoo. We don't really know how the dispositions of various individuals. You don't know, you know, it might be a bull, not a heifer, like, you don't know. You don't know what's going on, so just stay away from them. If you find yourself kind of moving through a paddock to get to your buffer, and you notice that you are now with, some livestock, just go ahead and back on out of there. I'd rather you take longer to get to your site and be able to do a little bit less work, but be safe. Just kind of try to stay out of paddocks that have animals in them at all times. Also, at all times, leave the gates how they are left when you find them. So we have a spring gate here that is open. It's not closed. If we wanted to close it, we would just pop this off here, hook it on to the fence over there. That would complete that circuit, and the animals would not be able to move through this crossing. But the farmers don't. The farmers want them to be able to move through here, so they have it like this for a reason. If a gate is closed, please, 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 please close it. Especially if it is leaving the farm or the pasture completely. We do not want these cows to be out on the highway because of our efforts. So always leave the gates as you found them. The fences are another really big source of potential risk. I have been shocked many, many, many times. Every year I get shocked a bunch of times because I'm always working around them. A lot of Alliance staff have been shocked a million times too. Odds are you'll be completely fine if you get shocked, especially, most of these are just keeping cows out. The current that's running through them is not super, super high, but it's still really uncomfortable and it's not fun, and you never know. Maybe if someone has like a pacemaker or something, it might be actually really dangerous for you to get shocked. So just don't touch the fences. Even if you're certain it's off, it's a good idea to just not touch it. Don't touch the wires. Oftentimes there's some space where you can go underneath fences. You can kind of roll underneath. Be very, very careful when you're doing that, because if you touch the fence, if you touch a hot wire with your body and you're also touching the ground, the current will go through you into the ground and it will hurt way more. If I am insulated from the ground here because I'm wearing my neoprene muck boots and I grab the fence, I'll get shocked, but it won't be that bad because the current will travel through me and then back into the fence. It won't run through me. I won't be conducting that electricity into the ground. So be very, very careful when crawling underneath fences. And that's one of the reasons I recommend just, even if it's a little bit out of your way, it's a better idea to just, go to the gate. I think probably the other bigger, safety concern is going to be hydration issues. Make sure you bring water, bring it in your backpack, bring it in your bucket, have it with you at all times, have a snack too. You never know, even if you're, don't have any blood sugar issues, sometimes when you're working out in the sun for hours and hours, you'll start to develop, you'll get low blood sugar. And so, yeah, good to have a little snack, good to have some water around. Make sure you're wearing sunscreen, make sure you have eye protection, hand protection, feet protection, always, always, always. And again, I would, some sites that are very, clean mode, like a park or a lawn or something, you might be fine getting away with wearing shorts, but I like to wear pants when I'm kind of working outside. You never know, better to protect yourself than to wish you had full protection on.